Okay, Chapter 19, From Crisis to Empire. This chapter concentrates on America's journey from a split government following the Civil War until its emergence as a world power in the late 1800s. Remember, in the last chapter, we spoke about the great gains that America was making, but making unevenly. Several groups are being left behind as the giant corporations become richer and begin to dominate politics. This chapter examines how farmers are going to mobilize into a political force, eventually culminating in the organization of what will be known as the Populist Party. And then later, we're going to look at the process of empire building that occurs in the United States. So, broad themes of this chapter, we're going to look at the ineffectiveness of the federal government. We're going to talk about the beginnings of populism. And then lastly, we'll finish up with the rise of Imperial America. So let's talk about politics, especially politics at the national level. Now, if you remember in the last chapter, we mentioned that until the very late 1800s, the nation is almost exactly split between the Republicans and the Democrats. And usually what determined the winning party was who could get out the vote better. In fact, very slim majorities. The winning percentage was usually less than 1.5%. So incredibly close elections during this time from the end of the Civil War until we get around the year 1900. People are devoutly, fanatically loyal to their parties. And the thing about it is, people are not incredibly loyal to their parties because of the extreme, distinct positions that the parties take on public issues. Essentially, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, they're basically the same party. And so what reason that people voted the way that they did was not necessarily because they agreed with the position of the party, because the position of the party might usually be the same. What determined how you vote was much more influenced by the region and where you lived. And it was pretty easy to narrow this down. If you lived in the South, you were a Democrat. If you lived in the North, you were a Republican. Those old holdovers from the Civil War era still hold true. Now, other things also play a role in this. Ethnicity, religion play a role in how you voted the way that you did. But by and large, the reason you voted the way you did depended on where you lived. Now, the reason why the parties themselves could avoid the big ticket issues, the reason why they could avoid taking a stand on the substantive issues of the day, was because at this point in time, the federal government really didn't do anything. Remember that for most of America's history, the federal government is small, it's weak, and it's relatively ineffective. In the course of most people's lives, what was going on at the local level, what was going on at the state level, was much more important than what was going on at the national level. The president was some guy who lived in a White House maybe hundreds of miles away, right? What was much more important was what your local mayor was doing, what your state governor was doing. Those were the issues that really mattered. In fact, most people had no interaction with the federal government at all except for collecting their mail. For years and years and decades, the most important interaction that people had with the federal government was with the U.S. Post Office. So, okay, if you remember back to U.S. History 1, the act that really ended Reconstruction in the United States was the election of Rutherford B. Hayes as President of the United States. The president that follows Hayes is going to be James Garfield. Now, Garfield isn't really remembered for a whole lot because, as it turns out, he's going to have a pretty short presidency. And James Garfield will be elected in the election of 1880. He will later be assassinated in 1881. Garfield's most remembered for attempting civil service reform. Civil service refers to non-military government employees. And so what Garfield focused on was making sure the right person was hired for the government job. The best person was hired. It wasn't given to someone's son-in-law or someone's great nephew. The idea was you should have a test, right? And everybody who wants the job takes the test, and whoever scores the highest on that test should get the job. That's what Garfield focused on, and that's what he's best known for. Well, after he's assassinated, Chester A. Arthur becomes president, and he's going to follow in Garfield's footsteps. That's also going to be what he focuses on, and in fact, he will pass what's known as the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act is the first civil service reform act in the United States, and essentially that's how the government operates today. If you want to work for the federal government, you have to take a test, and those who score best on the test have the best chance of getting the job. Okay, so that brings us up to the election of 1884. Arthur didn't want to run for re-election, and so we have two new challengers come in for the presidency. We have James Blaine, who's running for the Republicans, and we have Grover Cleveland, who's running for the Democrats. This is a very close election, a very hotly debated election, and what it comes down to actually is that James Blaine does not have a great reputation. Apparently, he was a rather unsavory character, and a lot of his fellow Republicans balked at the notion of supporting him. Even his own party, certain members of his own party, did not want to see him become president. And so a lot of these Republicans are actually going to support Cleveland. Imagine that. A bunch of Republicans are actually going to support the Democratic nominee for president. These Republicans that supported the Democratic nominee were known as mugwumps. I don't know where they came up with that name, but they were the mugwumps, Republicans that supported the Democratic nominee, Cleveland. And with their support, he is eventually going to win the presidency. So that brings us up to the election of 1888. Cleveland, as the incumbent, the person who is already in the office, is going to run for re-election against Benjamin Harrison. Now, Benjamin Harrison is actually going to be the grandson of William Henry Harrison, a former president, so he has that in his bloodline, right? He has that experience with the presidency. And as it turns out, the biggest issues in the election of 1888 are going to be tariffs and trusts. Now remember, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. So, for example, something that was produced in Great Britain and shipped to be sold in the United States, they had to pay a special tax on that. That's known as a tariff. Now, business owners loved the idea of tariffs because they made foreign-made goods artificially higher. For example, let's say that you own an American factory, and remember, America industrializes later than Europe, so our technology is not as efficient. We haven't been doing this as long. We're not as good at it yet. So there's an American company that makes soap, and so the American bar of soap is going to be $1 a piece. That's what they're going to sell their soap for. And then you have the French factory that makes soap. They've been doing it longer. They're more efficient at it. They've got better technology. They can produce soap for 50 cents a bar. And if you're a consumer who's buying a good in an American store and you see that there's an American bar of soap for $1 and a French bar of soap for 50 cents, you're going to buy the French soap, right? Because it's cheaper. Well, that hurts American business. So what they do is they add a tax to that. And so they tell France, every bar of soap that you want to sell in the United States, you have to pay an extra $1 tax on it. Now, all of a sudden, the American-made bar of soap is $1 and the French soap is $1.50. And so if you're faced with buying one of those two brands of soap, you're going to buy the American one. So business loves the idea of tariffs because they protect American manufacturing. The problem with this is that farmers especially don't like tariffs because they have no stake in American manufacturing. They don't care who makes the soap because they're farmers. They don't have any business interest. They don't care who makes the soap. They just want the cheapest soap they can buy. And so if they know they could have had soap at 50 cents, but now they're having to pay $1, farmers really don't like tariffs. And of course, we spoke about trusts last time. Essentially, a trust is a monopoly. So, okay, these are the big issues that are beginning to bubble up in the late 1800s. tariffs and trusts. As it so happens, Benjamin Harrison is going to win, although he does not win the popular vote. And this happens every so often in the United States. It's possible to be elected president by winning the Electoral College and yet not have the most people vote for you. This is what happened in the year 2000, right? Al Gore actually got the most votes, but he did not win the Electoral College, and so George W. Bush became president. Anyway, Benjamin Harrison wins the election of 1888. Really didn't do anything with tariffs. As a matter of fact, the Republicans are going to raise the tariff under McKinley. It's known as the McKinley tariff, to one of the highest levels in United States history, and actually make a lot of people mad at them. But they do sign the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, just looking at the title, you would think Sherman Antitrust Act. It's designed to go against trusts. It's designed to get rid of these monopolies. As it turns out, it's mainly a symbolic gesture. It has no teeth to it. It has no enforcement mechanism. It has no real power. So on paper, it says, yes, the federal government is concerned about trusts and we're going to do something about these monopolies, but in reality, it doesn't do anything about these monopolies. And in fact, the Sherman Antitrust Act it's mostly used not against monopolies, it's mostly used against labor unions, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. But the Sherman Antitrust Act, no real power, very ineffective. And so that leads us up to what becomes known as the populist challenge. Because there are a lot of people who are deeply unhappy in the United States. And in the last chapter, we already spoke about labor, right? The working class in the United States feel that they're being exploited. They look at the rich getting incredibly rich. They look at the Carnegies. They look at the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the DuPonts, who are becoming billionaires. And then you have the working class who might be living in the slums, the tenements of these major manufacturing cities, right? So as labor is growing restless in the cities, we're going to find out that farmers are growing restless in the countryside. And farmers are particularly angry with the federal government. Agricultural prices are falling. Farmers aren't making as much money. Farmers blame it on railroads. They blame it on specifically the lack of regulations with railroads, the lack of regulations in banks. They blame it on falling interest rates. They blame it on the fiscal policies of the federal government. And the first movement we see that grows out of this is going to be known as the Grange. Now, the Grange actually begins shortly after the Civil War, and it begins as a social group. Remember that being a farmer in the United States is a particularly isolating profession, right? You live out in the country. There's no technology, right? There's no TV. There's no radio. Telegraph wires don't stretch out into the country. So living a farmer can be a pretty isolated life. And so the Grange actually begins as a social group where farmers can get together and socialize. And eventually, as all these farmers are meeting together and they talk about all the problems that they're all facing, they realize that maybe they can have an influence in economic action. So that they began to set up farmer co-ops. Well, what happens is a lot of people don't like the idea of farmers organizing in the United States, and they begin to launch lawsuits against them. And the courts for years, and we'll talk about this later as well, until really the 1930s and 40s, the United States court system took a very dim view on organized farmers and organized labor. And so more often than not, people who had lawsuits against organizations like labor unions are going to win. So the courts are going to destroy the Grange. And as a matter of fact, as it turns out, times get better. And so as agricultural prices rise and people begin to make more money, they feel less pressure to take any sort of political action, right? Because, hey, times are good. I don't feel the need to go out and be active anymore. Okay, so the Grange falls by the wayside. following the Grange a little bit later, as again, farming is a very boom or bust proposition. Some years you're doing really well, some years you're not doing very well at all. Well, as we hit one of these low points again, we begin to see what are known as the farmers' alliances, much more widespread than the Grange was. Many more members, and they're able to take more economic action. And it's the exact same thing that happens with the labor unions that we spoke about in the last chapter. As more and more people gather, there's only so much that farmers' co-ops can accomplish, right? There's only so much economic action that a co-op can accomplish. And so people begin to realize if we want to have true, lasting, permanent solutions, we're going to have to do that through the political process. We're going to have to get people elected into office to pass the laws, to pass the permanent laws that we want. And so the farmers begin talking about creating a third political party. Now, third political parties historically do not do well in the United States, and they never have. Since our inception, we have been a two-party system. Whether that was the Republicans and the Federalists, or the Whigs and the Democrats, or the Democrats and the Republicans, whatever the parties are, we've always been a two-party system. But the farmers want to create a third political party, and that's exactly what they do. They create what's known as the People's Party. The members are known as the Populists. The Populists first taking part in the election of 1892. And they're actually pretty successful. Maybe not so much on the national stage. There was never a populist president, for example. But definitely at the local and state levels, many members of the People's Party are going to be elected into office, especially in the western states where, most of the farmers are. Now, populism mainly appeals to small, isolated farmers. They don't have any support among labor because most of the working class are actually going to support the Republican Party. And the reason they support the Republican Party is because the Republican Party supported tariffs. And so the working class wants tariffs. They want to protect their manufacturing jobs, so they're going to support the Republican Party. Also, very little support among minorities. And the reason for that is because of the farmers of the South. Remember, the South, following the Civil War, is still heavily segregated. There are many discriminatory laws still on the books following the Civil War, even though, slavery is ended. The era of Jim Crow is just getting kicked off, and we'll talk about that later as well. And most of these Southern farmers don't want minorities in their political party. So mainly supported by small farmers, very little support among labor or minorities. Now, what were the sort of things that the populists were fighting for? Well, they had a whole laundry list of things they would like to see happen. Number one, they wanted what they called a Subtreasury system. And this was essentially having loans for them backed up by the federal government. They wanted to use their crops as collateral for loans when times were bad. The idea was if crop prices fell, instead of having to sell them on the market for a reduced price, they could go to the government and say, we need a loan, here, take these crops as collateral. And so the federal government would essentially be underwriting these loans to farmers during bad times, which is what they wanted. Another thing they wanted was direct election of U.S. senators. Now, this is actually interesting because prior to this, as a regular person, you did not vote on your U.S. senator. What happened was you elected your state legislature. Now, you did directly elect your state legislature, and then the state legislature would elect among themselves. They would choose who they wanted to be the U.S. senator was, which is actually kind of interesting because in Congress, people directly elected members of the House of Representatives, but not the U.S. Senate. You have no input whatsoever on the U.S. Supreme Court. And then you really don't have a whole lot of input on who the president is. Now, yes, there's the popular vote. And most of the time, the person that wins the popular vote wins the presidency, but not always the case. Just like Benjamin Harrison, just like George W. Bush, you can actually be elected president without winning the popular vote. So they wanted more input into who was running their government. They wanted direct election of U.S. senators. They wanted government control of the currency. At this point in time, the United States is on what's known as the gold standard. And that means that every bill that was printed in the United States was backed up by gold somewhere. You know, when you're a little kid and you always see cartoons of Fort Knox, it's, you know, this giant room that's just filled to the ceiling with gold bars. And the reason for that is because every U.S. bill had a serial number stamped on it, and that serial number was tied to a piece of gold somewhere in a place like Fort Knox. And that meant you could only print as much money as you had gold. Well, they wanted to do away with that. They wanted to get off of the gold standard. The reason for that is with a looser money policy, it makes debts less important, and we'll talk about why in just a second. But they wanted government control of the currency and not relying on the gold standard. They wanted a graduated income tax, and that was the idea that the more money you make, the more money you pay in taxes, and not just as a flat fee, but you pay a greater percentage of your income in taxes. So, for example, let's just say that there's a person that makes $1,000 and a person that makes $100,000. And if you have a flat tax, you know, everybody pays 10%. That is a flat tax. It doesn't matter if you make $10,000. It doesn't matter if you make $1 million. Everybody pays 10%. That's what we had. They wanted a graduated income tax. They wanted you to pay a greater percentage. So at, you know, $1,000, you might pay 5% of your income, but $1 million, you pay 25% of your income. So you're not just paying more money. Obviously, 10% of $1 million is going to be more than 10% of a 10,000, right? But they wanted you to pay a greater percentage of your income. And then a right to form unions. And so looking at the list of demands that populists had, most of these actually come to pass. We do have direct election of U.S. senators. We pass a constitutional amendment that says the people shall have the right to vote on who they want to represent them in the U.S. Senate. We do have government control of the currency. We are no longer on the gold standard. We do have a graduated income tax. We do have the right to form unions. So a lot of the things that the populists are fighting for actually come to pass. Now, they may not come to pass while the populists are around, but they do eventually come to pass. All right, the unquestioned leader of the populists is going to be, at this point, a young man by the name of William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan is going to come to national prominence first in the election of 1896. And it all has to do with the debate around the government's fiscal policy. And again, at this time, the United States is still on the gold standard. Every dollar printed had to be backed up by gold, and this is going to limit the money supply since America only has so much gold. Well, what the populists were fighting for, if they wanted eventually to be off the gold standard completely. But Bryan knew that was never going to happen, or at least he knew it wasn't going to happen right away. So he went for a compromise. He said, look, in addition to gold, let's also add silver. There's a lot more silver around than there is gold. So the idea was that would enlarge the money supply. More money is going to benefit the farmers. And I'm going to tell you why. It all has to do with the issue of debt. Money is like anything else. It is all governed by the laws of supply and demand. The more money there is, the less valuable it is. The less money there is, the more valuable it is. It all has to do with supply and demand. And so let me explain how this works. Let's say you're a farmer and you took out a loan to buy whatever. You took out a loan to buy a tractor. There aren't a lot of tractors at this point in time, but let's just say for the sake of argument, you take out a $1,000 loan to buy a tractor. And this is while the money is tied to gold. And so money has a fixed value. Well, you're paying on this tractor, you're paying on this $1,000 loan, and all of a sudden the government adds silver to the money supply. And so now it can enlarge the money supply. It can print more bills. And now that there are more bills, according to the law of supply and demand, the value of money is going to fall. So now all of a sudden you still owe $1,000, but that $1,000 doesn't buy as much as it used to. In effect, what has happened since the government enlarged the money supply, your debt is not as great as it once was, because now it's easier to get a hold of money because there's more of it floating around. That's why farmers wanted to increase the money supply. It's very good for debtors. And of course, if you know anything about farming, you are constantly in debt, right? So they wanted to enlarge the money supply to help pay down their debt. That is why farmers are in favor of it. And that is going to be one of the central issues of the election of 1896, which, as it so happens, is going to be the first time Bryan is going to run for the presidency. Bryan is not even a Democrat, okay? He happens to be at the Democratic convention, and he stands up to give a speech. It's his famous Cross of Gold speech. I'll put a link up so you can listen to it for yourself, but it's a very stirring, motivational speech. And at the end of the speech, the people are stunned. They can't believe what they're hearing. And all of a sudden, people stand up and they're cheering and they want Bryan. They elect Bryan as the nominee. And he's not even really a member of the Democratic Party. And so what happens is that the populist movement is fused to the Democratic Party. When William Jennings Bryan runs for the president for the first time, it fuses the populist movement and the Democratic Party together. Well, the Republicans nominate Bill McKinley, who probably wins. And when Bill McKinley wins the presidency, it kills the populist movement in the United States, at least for a while. We'll see it come back in different forms as we move into the 1900s. As a famous example, Teddy Roosevelt's later going to run for president as a member of the Populist Party, which it runs on some of the same concepts, but it's a different being than the People's Party was at the late 1800s. And that's what happens when Bill McKinley wins the presidency. Populism is going to dissolve in the United States, especially when he raises tariffs and he signs the Gold Act of 1900, which solidifies the gold standard in the United States. Okay, fair enough. Something else to remember about William Jennings Bryan is that in many ways he is the first modern nominee for the American presidency. And what I mean by that is the tradition was that as the candidate for the presidency, you let other people go out and sing your praises. You as the candidate didn't do anything. You let other people go out and say, this is why you should elect Bill McKinley as president. It was considered uncouth for you to go out yourself and to ask for money. It was considered crass for you to go out and give speeches in your own defense. Well, William Jennings Bryan changed all that. He began really the first modern American presidency by doing extensive fundraising. He was known for giving speeches from the backs of trains. The train would pull into town. Bryan would come out on the back step of the caboose or whatever. He would give his speech, and then they would move on to the next town. And so in many ways, even though people kind of derided it at the time, they kind of made fun of him at the time, he was really the first modern candidate for the American presidency. Now, of course, he doesn't win. And as a matter of fact, he will later go on to run an additional, I think he ran for president in total 4 times. And of course, there was never President Bryan. He never wins. But anyway, he's pretty important to the presidential making process in the United States. Okay, this slide, the historiography of populism, we're not going to talk about that right now. I may come back and cover this in a video a little bit later, but for right now, you can skip this slide. Let's talk about the American Empire. By the 1890s, Americans have spread across the continent. The frontier had been closed. We had, spread from sea to shining sea, and people are ready to expand again. And there's a few reasons why people are looking to expand as we move into the 1900s. Number one, the defeat of the Native Americans gave a precedent. We knew that we could take it on, so to speak. There were fears that our natural resources were going to dry up. Remember, we are still industrializing. We're still building factories. We're still building railroads. We need more oil. We need more coal. We need more iron ore. And so we were afraid we would eventually run out. And so expansion was seen as a way to gather more natural resources without using up our own. The idea was that an aggressive foreign policy would be an outlet for domestic problems. It would take people's minds off, labor unrest and farmer unrest. If they could focus on something else, it was a safety valve, so to speak. People could let off their steam with this aggressive foreign policy and not really concentrate on what's going on back here in the United States. And then lastly, it was a search for new markets. We are now producing so much stuff that we can't buy it all. We have to find new people to sell to. Because we cannot continue to grow if we don't find new markets. And so expansion was also seen as a way to find new markets to sell to for all these American manufactured goods that we are now producing. And most people are okay with this. Remember, the idea behind manifest destiny, that we are God's new chosen people, that we have the best form of government on the face of the earth, and it's our duty and obligation to spread that government at least as far as the Pacific Ocean and maybe even abroad, right? That's the whole idea behind manifest destiny, that the United States, the Anglo-Saxon race of the United States was seen as the protector of liberty and the protector of Christianity. This idea of divine commission, that is our job to do this. And so most people were okay with expansion. Some people are not, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But most people in the United States are okay with the idea of expanding beyond the continental United States. And there's two great examples of this, the examples of Hawaii and Cuba. Now, Cuba was already dominated by the United States. As it turns out, Hawaii is in a great geographic location for ships traveling across the Pacific. So as we are looking to open up more trade with Asia, specifically China, Hawaii is in a great position for us as a way station. Ships can dock there, they can take on supplies, they can take on fuel. Hawaii also has great natural harbors. And so the Navy was especially interested in putting a military base on Hawaii. And American businessmen are interested in Hawaii because of its sugar plantations. Remember, sugar is still a very, very valuable global commodity. And so the more sugar you can grow, the more money you have. And so everybody wants Hawaii, whether it was for shipping interest or military interest or business interest, everybody wants Hawaii. And over the years, Hawaii was dominated by Americans. American businessmen had invested money and built plantations on Hawaii. In 1887, we first get our treaty for a naval base at Pearl Harbor. So even though technically Hawaii is independent, it is its own country, it is dominated by American interests. Well, in 1891, we see a new ruler come to power in Hawaii. Hawaii is its own separate country. It's a monarchy. They have kings and queens. Well, in 1891, Queen, and I know I'm going to butcher this, Queen Liliuokalani is going to come to power. And the thing about Queen L is that she is fiercely independent. She is a strong nationalist. And as it turns out, a lot of Hawaiians are angry about the growing influence of the United States. They don't want the United States to have so much power over their local affairs. And so when Queen L comes to power and she begins giving speeches about taking power back for Native Hawaiians, a lot of people are going to get on board with this. And that makes the American business interests very scared because they've put a lot of money into Hawaii. They've invested a lot in Hawaii, and they don't want to lose that investment. And as it turns out, they're going to get their chance just a couple of years later. In 1893, an economic recession is going to hit Hawaii, and the U.S. business interests are going to stage a coup. They are going to remove Queen L from power. They organize a rebellion to overthrow the royal government. And in 1898, Hawaii is going to become a U.S. territory. And of course, later they'll become a U.S. state in 1959. But they had been a vital part of America for long before that. So you can see it starts off with American business interests. They were scared they were going to lose that investment, and eventually Hawaii is going to become a United States state. Similar story with Cuba. Cuba at this time was a colony in the dying Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire had been around since the 1500s, right? And so we are on the tail end of the Spanish Empire, and it's losing control over its colonies. It's not nearly as powerful as it once was, and a lot of its colonies are fighting for independence. And Cuba is going to do that. Cuba is going to revolt against Spain. Now, of course, Cuba is right on our back doorstep, right? It's, less than 100 miles from the coast of Florida. And so we have a very keen interest about what's going on in Cuba. Plus, of course, given our own circumstances, we were a colony that fought for our independence against Great Britain. They're a colony fighting for their independence. We have a soft spot in our heart for rebels, right? So we are very interested in what's going on in Cuba. Well, we decided to get involved in the war for Cuban independence for a couple of reasons. Number one, we have what's known as yellow journalism. American newspaper editors realized that they could sell a lot more papers by exaggerating what was going on in the world. If you've ever heard the old adage, if it bleeds, it leads. People don't want to read more uplifting stories about puppies, right? The things that sell newspapers are natural disasters, are massive deaths, are war and death and destruction. And newspapers realized this, and so they exaggerated the accounts of Spanish war crimes and Spanish cruelty and, oh, these poor Cubans, what are they going to do? We have to do something to help them. In reality, Cuba was already winning the war. Cuba didn't really need our help one way or the other. But that's not the story that people were reading in newspapers, because the newspaper editors and the newspaper publishers wanted to sell more papers. And we also have the Maine incident. The Maine is an American warship which was docked at Havana, which of course is in Cuba, and it blew up. And nobody really knew what happened. As a matter of fact, we still don't know what happened to the Maine. But at the time, blame was laid squarely at the feet of the Spanish. We blamed the Spanish for blowing up our warship, so this demands we go to war. And that's exactly what happens. In 1898, Congress declares war against the Spanish Empire, and we embark on what's known as the Spanish-American War. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says that Europe will no longer have any say-so in what goes on in the New World, that is, the Americas. And so this was seen as an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, that Europe will no longer be the leader, that the United States will be the leader. So this was justified, and it was rationalized by the Monroe Doctrine. As it turns out, like I said, Cuba was already winning this war on her own. The war lasts a little over 4 months. Not very many American casualties. As it was famously referred to by Teddy Roosevelt, it was a splendid little war. And as a matter of fact, that's probably one of the most notable things that comes out of this war. This is the first time that Teddy Roosevelt becomes a household name in the United States. Teddy Roosevelt was actually a member of one of the old money families of New York. We don't have aristocratic classes here in the United States, but if we did, he would be one of the closest things to it. Old money, European origins, a Dutch origin. He was actually a highly placed member of the War Department. He was the assistant, He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he wants to go fight in this war, and his bosses tell him, no, you can't do that. You're too highly placed. So he actually resigns his commission. He essentially gathers up a militia, the so-called Rough Riders. He travels down to Cuba, and he joins in the war because he couldn't stand to be left out. And of course, he becomes famous for his part in the Battle of San Juan Hill. And the war, by and large, is a success for the United States. Very few casualties, but we get all these spoils of war, because at the end of the war, since we won, we receive from the Spanish Empire Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. So by the end of the war, we are in a possession of a rather small empire, an overseas empire. This isn't land like, say, the Louisiana Purchase, or even like Alaska that we bought, that is not part of the continental United States. This is an overseas empire. These are essentially colonies of the United States. Now, Cuba, at least on paper, got her independence, but in reality, not so much. During the war, there was an amendment known as the Teller Amendment that was passed. And the Teller Amendment stated Cuba will receive her independence. We're fighting this war on behalf of the Cubans to give them a chance at self-destiny, right? A chance at self-government. After the war is over, an entirely different amendment known as the Platt Amendment is signed. And the Platt Amendment says that Cuba is going to be dominated by the United States, essentially. Cuba can no longer sign treaties without gaining the approval of the United States. So, they weren't their own country. They had to ask their big brother, the United States, for permission. The amendment said that the United States could intervene militarily whenever it saw fit in Cuba. As a matter of fact, this is when we established Guantanamo Bay. Part of the Platt Amendment said that we will have a military base on Cuba for forever. And if you've ever wondered to yourself, now things have become better in the past few years between the United States and Cuba, but going back to the 60s, we had a total disconnect, right? We refused to acknowledge the existence of each other. If you ever wondered why, during the War on Terror, everybody was talking about this military base on Cuba, who we have no diplomatic relations with, it's because it goes all the way back to the 1800s with the Platt Amendment that said we will always have a military interest in Cuba. We will always have a military base on Cuba, Guantanamo Bay. Okay, and of course, the same story as in Hawaii. American business interests quickly move into Cuba. They dominate Cuba, and Cuba is essentially little more than a colony of the United States. And of course, as we know, people will eventually, in the 40s and 50s, revolt against the United States government, and it will lead to the establishment of eventually a communist government in Cuba. But that's all coming several decades in the future. This is the beginning of commercial imperialism for the United States. We don't necessarily march in and plant the flag, even though we do that. We are not looking to make these colonies necessarily part of the American political system. We are trying to influence these new colonies by way of financial matters. So especially with the opening of Latin America, we don't march into Nicaragua and plant the American flag and say this land is now part of the United States. No, we go in and we buy up land and we begin banana plantations and sugar plantations and we develop American business interests. So that becomes sort of the standard operating procedure of the United States from the late 1800s through up to the 1920s, really, through the 1920s. We don't necessarily march in troops and plant the flag and say this is now a United States colony. No, ours was a commercial imperialism. We want to dominate you with the strength of not our military, but the strength of our economy. And we do see the opening of Latin America. We become much more interventionist in what's going on in Central and South America. And the open door policy, we become much, now that we have the Philippines, that's right off the back door of China, right? Now we have a military presence in Asia. We've always had Hawaii, but this is in Asia. And so the Philippines and Guam, they strengthen our Pacific presence. And now we become much more interested in what's going on in China, because China is the great untapped market. Just, our interest in what's China is doing, and that's not only been going on for the past 10, 15, 20 years. China has always been a major player in world economics, if only because they have so many people. And China, for many years, was not industrialized. They didn't make any manufactured goods, so everything they bought had to come from overseas. And so China has always represented this. It was the mother lode of new markets, right? You have all these, even then you have hundreds of millions of Chinese people to sell to, and everybody wants a slice of that pie. And so that was the open door policy, that everybody should have a chance to sell in China, not just the United States, not just Great Britain, not just the French, but China had an open door for everyone. And we'll talk more about that as the semester goes on. As we know, Puerto Rico becomes dominated by the United States, and they do eventually become a territory. They're not a state yet, even though the people of Puerto Rico have the same rights as a United States citizen. They have no representation in Congress. So they exist in a bit of a gray area, although I do remember hearing back in, I believe it was 2012, the last presidential election, I think pretty much every presidential election, every 4 years, the people of Puerto Rico vote on whether or not they want to become a U.S. state. And for every election up to 2012, they had always voted no. They do not want to be the next United States state. Well, in 2012, for the first time, more people voted yes than no. Now, that doesn't mean anything because Congress has to authorize it, right? But it's finally got to the tipping point where more Puerto Ricans actually want to be a United States state. And to be fair, they get most of the benefits of being a state without a lot of the negatives. But as it turns out, the economy in Puerto Rico right now has taken a sharp nosedive. They are heavily in debt. So I think a lot of people see a possible statehood as kind of a safety line. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The Philippines are an entirely different story. The Philippines were liberated from the Spanish Empire only to be thrown into the American Empire. They didn't want to be part of any empire. They wanted their own country. And so they asked the Americans for independence, and we say no. And so the Filipinos actually end up fighting their own war of independence, an incredibly brutal, at times horrific war against the United States, and they lost. And the Philippines will be a protectorate of the United States up through World War II into the 1960s, I believe. So, it's kind of ironic. Here we are. As a matter of fact, this is the question. What is the point of imperialism? Here we are, the United States. We are supposed to be the beacon, the light of democracy and freedom in the world. And many people are going to criticize these imperialist tendencies. After all, the right of self-determination, the right of self-government is sacred to the United States. That's why we fought our revolution, and here we are denying it to people. How can we be that, how can we be that hypocritical, really? And so we see organizations that criticize this. Probably the most famous is the Anti-Imperialist League, who has leaders such as Andrew Carnegie and Mark Twain and Samuel Gompers, and they all criticize imperialism for different reasons, and sometimes they're not the nicest reasons, but at least they're against the idea of this so-called empire of liberty. If you're in favor of imperialism, well, then that answer is easy. Increased power for the United States, increased global influence for the United States, more markets for the United States, more natural resources for the United States. It's easy to make the argument why we should have colonies, why we should have protectorates. But again, is that being hypocritical? And people begin to ask themselves, this so-called empire of liberty, that's almost an oxymoron, right? How do you have an empire of liberty? This idea goes all the way back to Thomas Jefferson. When we first bought the Louisiana Purchase, and this idea of spreading liberty across the United States, to the world. Well, what happens if people don't want our brand of liberty? This empire of liberty, how do you justify that? And the question is, Did it happen? Did our colonies, did our protectorates want to be part? Do they still feel free? And so that's a question for another day.